Those children that are going through high conflict marriages or high conflict divorces, who are victims of child abuse and neglect, who are victims of war, or accidents, those people grow up into adults. And, the adults that those children once were are running around in the world with those same belief systems and those same piled up feelings that make for a very, very vulnerable experience in the world.
If you're just tuning in, my guest is Denise Houston. She is a therapist in Atlanta.
Right.
What's
North Metro Atlanta. Yes. About 15 miles north of the city.
Okay. In Georgia.
Yes.
North of Atlanta. And she is a licensed professional counselor. She is phenomenal. She has a ton of great information, and she approaches her therapeutic duties from the standpoint of, well, not necessarily, is that accurate? Approaching it from the standpoint of, from the perspective of when we were kids, or is it more accurate to say really kind of drilling down and going back to figure out the source of why it is we do what we do?
Well, it's trauma-informed or loss-informed. In other words, it looks at your experience in the world, your adverse experience, and seeing how that might be contributing to the problem that you present for therapy to be corrected. So, again, sometimes as adults, James, people get hurt. And so, sometimes it's as adults that we are working on experience, that the rate of sexual assault, of victims of crime, some of those things occur as adults. And so, we would be working on those issues from an adult perspective. But I would also be going back, because a lot of the women who present for therapy for adult victims of sexual assault, when you go back, it's not unusual to find in their childhood somewhere or in their adolescence, a date rape or a sexual assault or some sort of adverse experience as a child. So I approach things from a trauma-informed perspective within a framework of child development, how we come to understand the world and how we develop a sense of self.
So if I say the phrase trauma-informed to a mental health professional, that should mean something? That's a term of art for your profession?
Absolutely, it should mean something, yes.
Okay, so I can substitute that for inner child. I don't have to use
Correct.
that anymore. I can take that out of my brain and take that out of my database.
Well, I don't want to discount that phraseology, James, because Charles Whitfield, he's a therapist here still. He was really one of the first people to bring to the attention of the mental health community that unresolved experience as children, really still is informing adult behavior. So I don't want to be discounting of that, but I think, again, if I bring up that phraseology in the therapy session, people respond typically as you did.
We bristle a bit, don't we?
Yeah, to discount.
Why do we bristle like that? You talked about the idea that it seems, or essentially our self-perception that, I'm a 50-something-year-old adult, I'm a 30-something-year-old adult, I'm out here in the world, I'm supporting myself, I'm working, I'm doing all these things, that it seems I shouldn't have to do that. I should be able to handle it. Why do we react that way?
Well, I think that we so value, as a culture, this, again, rugged individualism, this action-oriented, successful, really don't need anybody kind of thing, super independent, so as not to be vulnerable. And when you start looking at adverse experience, trauma experience as a child, you are diving directly into vulnerability. And I think it shakes up how we would like to see ourselves. And people are, I think, a little frightened of that. They don't understand the impact of that. It sort of conflicts with sometimes how they would like to see themselves. And I think this is probably more true of men than it is women.
Absolutely. I can believe that. We have this sort of, that self-perception thing, whether you call it macho or manly or whatever that is, to let that down and let that go causes, like, in my mind anyway, that whole concept, that whole idea of, you're being weak, you're not handling the things that you're supposed to, that you're charged with handling, and being the strong person that, society tells you you're supposed to be, and that I want to be, at least to myself.
Exactly. And I think that goes back, James, to how we define masculinity, for boys and young men. And I think we at times do a poor job of that, because we put masculinity in one category and we put vulnerability in a completely different category, and they cannot touch each other.
Exactly. It's like the vegetables on the plate for some people, where your peas can't touch your mashed potatoes.
Disservice. That's a tremendous disservice to men.
Absolutely.
Because number one, it's a wonderful relational positive attribute to be able to be vulnerable, to be able to keep an open heart, to be able to access your emotions. That's going to make you more successful in relationships. But I think somehow men grow up to see vulnerability as just anathema. It is just not, I cannot be masculine and vulnerable at the same time, therefore I will not enter into any process, especially a therapeutic one where I'm talking about the vulnerability of childhood, in such a way that it takes away from my perceived masculinity. And it keeps people hamstrung, I think, in old patterns of maladaptive coping skills.
We see that in the extraordinarily higher rates of suicide with men, higher rates of success, certainly, with men. Looking at your website, anxiety, depression, mood disorder, trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, grief and loss, child abuse and neglect. The list goes on. Chronic illness, recovery issues, relationships, attachment, personal growth. All of these have the one thing in common, or do they all have the one aspect in common, that is you're dealing with a source of trauma and trying to address that issue?
That is accurate. Because a lot of people, James, the reason I put all that stuff, I specialize in all those areas, but people and even parents who bring children to me, a 9-year-old doesn't come in and sit down with me and say, Denise, I'm really here because of a traumatic experience I've had. I was, molested by an uncle several years ago, and it's made me incredibly angry, and I really don't trust myself, and I really feel oppositional and defiant much of the time, can't sleep. And so I'd really like some help resolving that.
You mean 9-year-olds don't have
do
the term in the vocabulary, oppositional and defiant?
What they do instead is they beat up the kids at school, or they become oppositional and defiant with their parents, or they don't do their schoolwork because they can't focus and they fail a grade and they get held back, or they are aggressive with their siblings. They can't sit down and explain to you what has happened in their experience and why they're behaving the way they are. Nor can the parents. The parents typically show up and they say, look, I've got a kid that's just out of control, or that's very aggressive with his peers, talks back to me, doesn't do his schoolwork. And so it does not present as trauma when it shows up in your office. It shows up as a behavioral problem. It shows up as someone who is anxious or depressed. It is only by taking a trauma-informed perspective and gathering information, both from the parent and from the child, that one goes back and figures out the root of where the presenting issues originate.
And one of the things that you do with professionals, other mental health professionals, is you put on a trauma training 5-day intensive for mental health professionals so that they can understand what this is. What about for parents? What about for teachers? What about for the non-mental health professionals? Or anything that we can use, take away, should understand, would help in thinking about a kid, heck, a coworker that's just, in a lay term, mean or aggressive, or some other disruptive conduct or behavior that gets in the way?
I want to say, first of all, I do training for lots of folks, James. I do it for therapists because I find that this trauma-informed approach is just not in a lot of therapists' training. It's not in their graduate school. It's not in their supervision as they begin to work with folks. It's typically, I train 12 people at a time. I keep the classes small so that we can get the most experience. Typically, 2 hands out of 12 are raised when I ask if anybody's had any training or education or exposure to trauma. And so I aligned myself with the Child Trauma Institute, which is up in northwestern Massachusetts. Dr. Ricky Greenwald runs it, and he figured out all this stuff and created a curriculum that can be shared with other professionals, which I'm quite passionate about and enjoy doing that work. But we also talk to parents, to foster parents especially. Foster parents need to understand this trauma-informed approach so that their placements don't disrupt, that they understand what's going on. Because once you have this perspective, James, then you understand there's a meaning behind behavior. You know, that there's a meaning behind aggression. There is a meaning behind children's behavioral problems, their self-harm, their cutting, their drug use. There is typically some strategy that they have employed to protect them from remembering or experiencing what has happened to them. So, yes, we talk to lots of people, and I do talk to parents, talk to PTA groups, church groups, you know, anybody that I can really get their attention, because it's important to understand whether you are mentoring a child, which is a lovely thing to do, by the way, and that's one of the things I think that people can do to help children grow into productive, healthy grown-ups and citizens. Whether you're mentoring a child, helping to raise a child, being a secondary caregiver for a child, if you are informed about the meaning of their behavior, you know, to what makes a child aggressive, you know, what would make a child all of a sudden have sleep disruption, you know, what would make a child very, isolating, not want to be with other peers. That's not typical. To have this approach that would say, you know what, something's up. I may not know what it is, and I may not know exactly how to intervene, but I can either bring that to the attention of their caregiver, or if it's my child, I can find a professional to help me figure this out, right? So I can have some understanding that this is not normal and typical, and that children don't create conflict, James, with adults in their lives just because they can. You know, there's very little payoff. If you're 9 years old and you've got the teacher mad at you, mom and dad are mad at you, nobody's ever glad to see you, you are constantly in trouble, you're never meeting expectations, there's no payoff for that. And so to continue to punish that only entrenches the very behavior that you're trying to extinguish. But if you come at it from a meaning of behavior perspective, like what is going on with this kid, obviously this behavior is not normal and typical. Something's up, and I wonder what that could be.
So when walk us through a thumbnail, if you would, of one of those presentations, whether it's to a PTA or to a group of step parents, what are the top things that you tell them to do?
One of the best things they can do is be attuned to their child, which just means that you have a relationship with your child that where they know that they can bring things to you that may be unpleasant or that may be disturbing, that may be distressing, that you have what we call a secure attachment in this field. Secure attachment means that you, being the child, have a relationship with your caregiver, that you know that that person is dependable, reliable, consistent, available to you. And it is through that relationship where you feel accepted and understood that you process the world, that you learn to make sense of things. So what I tell parents is develop the best relationship you possibly can with your child. Speak to them, read to them every day. Inquire with them about what their day was like. Tell me something good that happened today. Tell me something funny that happened today. Be aware of their friends. You know, who are they playing with and who's important to them. because it is that attachment relationship, that acceptance, that positive regard, that connection that then a child can come and say to you,